Hi there, my name is Chuck Rozanski and I'm the owner of Mile High Comics. This is the fifth in a series of video newsletters that I've been creating to try and give everyone a sense of what we do here at Mile High Comics. The first couple were based on trying to show you the number of comics that we have and the size of our Jason Street megastore. The last one, number 4, was where we went into a little bit of the philosophy behind what we try to do here in terms of stocking comics and some of the costs that are involved in that. This time I wanted this video to be a little bit more about the passion that goes behind Mile High Comics and sort of our belief in the way that we want to run the company. First off, I want to say that I've been a comic book fan since the late 1960s. And by fan, I mean that when I was 14 years old, I already had 3,000 comics, which in those days meant that I was collecting Marvel, DC, Harvey, Archie, all the comics that were being printed essentially at the time, all the Charltons, everything. And I became a dealer in 1970 when I bought my first major collection at the age of 14. I bought 4,000 comics from a kid whose mom had worked at the local ID wholesaler that serviced all the newsstands. And he had comics going all the way back to 1961. I borrowed $140 and it took me 2 years to pay it back, but I managed to buy that first big collection. At the time that I did that, there was a brand new book that had just come out called the Overstreet Price Guide, and the prices that were in there were sort of guesses that were gleaned from catalogs and from what Bob had seen at conventions and in fanzines. And so ever since then, pricing in the comics world has been an evolutionary process. The earliest price guide, believe it or not, a comic book in mint was considered to only be twice the value of a comic book in good. And that has obviously changed now to where a comic, especially a Golden Age comic that would be in 9.6 or 9.8 on the CGC scale, would be vastly more expensive. But at Mile High Comics, we don't sell those kinds of comics. That really isn't what we try to do. I'm still sort of locked in a time warp. I loved comics back in the late 1960s. I've loved them all ever since. I don't read that many modern comics, but my wife had a friend who went to the flea market the other day, and she bought this stack of old comics, and she paid 50 cents each, and they're 30-cent and 25-cent cover price. Mostly Harvey's, Richie Riches, there's an Uncle Scrooge in there, and a Barney the Bear, which was one of the Spire Christian comics that were published as a subsidiary of Archie around 1979. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about this Barney the Bear home plate, because it's the kind of comic that doesn't get very much respect in the comics world. It's in low grade. It's only maybe a VG. Looks like might be a good. I'd have to. Yeah, it's got a water stain, so it's a good. And so it's not going to sell for very much. And yet, this is the kind of comic that I actively seek to obtain, because as I pointed out in our last video newsletter, I try to document every comic that's ever been printed. And this Barney Bear at Home plate that was in this batch from the flea market is particularly interesting to me because it's a 49-cent edition and it's got the Christian spire up here at the top. Now, we already had this in our online database, but what's very interesting is that it could have been a variant, one that we never had before, because if you take a look at our website here, Christian Spire at one point was publishing with this entirely different logo. And so the 59-cent edition comes with the traditional spire, and then there's also this as a variant. I don't know that that is documented anywhere else in the world except for on our website, but it's the kind of thing that is what gets me up in the morning. I'm trying to contribute to the body of knowledge in terms of what's been published in the comics world. If someone did something that was for a class project, or if it was published as a small press book, or someone who did a mini comic, I'm trying to get the different variations on all of them and put them into one database. There's also the question of pricing in terms of the costs that we have to bear. We're sitting in a building right now that I had to purchase. I had no choice because the people that had this weren't willing to rent it, and so I had to sell some of my own Golden Age comics, the Red Raven one and my Spirit ones and things like that, in order to come up with a down payment for this building. But now, to keep this going, just in this building alone, we're paying $44,000 a year just in property taxes. If we were on the East Coast or in California, that would probably be 4 times that much for a building this size. But here in Colorado, blessedly, our taxes are relatively low, although 44 grand is still a tough nut to cover, especially when we're selling a lot of comics like this, where we're paying 50 cents each and then we're turning around and selling them for $2, $3, $4. There are a lot of dealers that won't even carry books like this. They don't want to. We run into a problem all the time where people are looking at the prices on our website and they're saying, well, I could buy this stack of books on eBay and somebody would have it up there for $40. Well, why do they do that? Well, the answer is because they just simply don't want to bother with it. Over the last 4 years, I can tell you that we've put away 2.2 million comics into the pulling files that we have over at the main warehouse, and they're still adding to those at the rate of about 50,000 a month. Again, I buy these comics for the longer term. I buy them because I love them. I buy them because I want to have them available for people in any price range. But it means that I'm not selling them in bulk. It means that I have to price them by the piece. We have to handle them by the piece. And there's a cost that's associated with that. At last year's Stan Lee Kamikaze Convention out in Los Angeles, we were the only dealers who set up, who had, or even tried to have, a full line of back issue comics along with us. There were 30 other dealers there that were selling comics, but all of them followed basically the same model. They would buy collections, and then they would cherry out whatever they thought they could sell on eBay, and they would put the rest of the comics out for $1. And they weren't in order, and there was really no delineation between comics that were desirable or hard to get and comics that were not, because there was no attempt made to differentiate. Okay, we've come down from my office upstairs. We're still in the Jason Street Megastore, and these are the bins that we take when we go to conventions. And I thought that showing them to you would give you a little bit of an illustration of the complexity of what we do and the fact that we're actually making some pretty good progress in that regard. These are comics where when we go to a convention, we try to make it really, really easy for people to find a given title. These are all Batman titles here, going up through Battlestar Galactica, but these are all Batman titles that begin with colon, starting with Batman colon Night Gallery and going through the end. But as you go along here, you'll see that what we're trying to do at Mile High Comics is to provide every single title that's ever been printed. And it's an enormous amount of work and pretty expensive, but on the other hand, it looks so cool to have it here. I mean, even when you have a title like Birds of Prey, this is just 1 copy each. That's what we take to conventions, except in rare instances. And just in the titles that begin with the letters, with numbers and with the letter A, there's 700 different titles that we offer right in that area. But this sort of gives a sense, taking this down here, each one of these bins holds about 2,000 comics, and there's 60 of these, and it takes 60 of these to hold all the comics that we try to take just to conventions. And we certainly don't take the smallest of the small press books. We don't take much in the way of silver and bronze from publishers other than Marvel and DC. So in other words, we don't have a huge selection of Charltons in here. We don't have a lot of Dells or Gold Keys. But we do have a pretty good selection of small press independents. And this is why I get up in the morning. This is what really makes me happy. I love seeing this all straightened out and ready to go. We won't be able to get this all done. Just repricing and going through and making sure that titles are correct. That work with those printouts that I showed you upstairs, I've estimated is going to take me 3 years. I'll get a lot done in the wintertime when things are a little slower, not so much in the summer when I'm getting ready for conventions. But I'm the only one who's willing to do something like that. It's just so much work. We tried to send quantitative data into the Overstreet at one time. We sent them printouts that were over 2,000 pages, and none of the information ever got used. They told us that they just tossed them because it was more data than they could handle. So we do it ourselves, and that's why our website is different than any other place that you go to on the internet. But on the other hand, you know, maybe we're not right 100% of the time, but at least we're looking at what actually sells, and we're taking the time to go through and really look at this in detail. So call me crazy, but this is something that I really want to do, and I really want to stock in every one of these titles. If there's a missing issue number in here, that's almost an affront to my nature. I really want to have everything, just so that when someone comes to my booth, that we know that we have for them what they're looking for. May not matter to other people, but it sure as heck matters to me. This is Chuck Rozanski, Mile High Comics. Thanks for taking the time to watch.